Joining our coverage, Jackie Alemany, Washington Post congressional investigations reporter, also an MSNBC contributor. Betsy Woodruff-Swan is back, national correspondent for Politico, also an MSNBC contributor. Miles Taylor's here, former chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security. He's now the co-founder and executive director of the Renew America movement. And our friend Jason Johnson's back, politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University, also an MSNBC political contributor. I want to start with the reporters. What was new that is added into what we all now know? You first, Jackie.
Yeah, Nicole, there's a few things that were new. There was the name drop of Congressman Andy Biggs, that he called Rusty Bowers the morning of January 6th, I believe it was, and directly pressured him and asked him to go along with the alternate scheme of electors, which Rusty Bowers declined to do. And then there was also the direct link between this plot to submit a phony slate of electors and the former president via Ronna McDaniel, the RNC head. She testified to investigators behind closed doors in video that was played during the hearing that the president called her. She picked up the phone and he said, "Hold on one sec, Ronna," and put on John Eastman, who then walked McDaniel through the legal coup he had drafted, essentially asking for the RNC's support, though McDaniel was quick to clarify that she viewed the RNC's role as a supporting role and not necessarily as the mechanism or operation that would be executing Eastman's ideas.
Such a good thing to flag. Let me play some of Eastman's appeal to the Georgia legislature on the elector scheme. For my control room, it's number 5.
You could also do what the Florida legislature was prepared to do, which is to adopt a slate of electors yourselves. And when you add in the mix of the significant statistical anomalies and sworn affidavits and video evidence of outright election fraud, I don't think it's just your authority to do that, but quite frankly, I think you have a duty to do that, to protect the integrity of the election here in Georgia.
So we now know, Betsy Woodruff-Swan, that upon examining just some of the committee's evidence, a federal judge thinks that John Eastman more likely than not committed felonies. Hearing that was more ominous with that analysis in the public record, in the judicial record. I wonder your thoughts tying not just Eastman, but Trump to, the phony elector scheme wasn't some madcap circus-like thing. It was a crime. It is a crime to submit fraudulent electors who do not represent the will of the votes in any said state. What did you make of the recitation and almost the repetitive nature of witness testimony, proving that it wasn't just Rudy, wasn't just Cleta Mitchell? Eastman was involved, Trump was involved, Rudy was involved, up and down the White House and campaign operation. They had their hands on this conspiracy to submit fraudulent electors.
Yeah, there's so much that's notable about this particular wonky but really important piece of the Trump campaign's effort to overturn the election. Robert Sinners emerging as a new voice, or a larger voice, in this committee hearing, I thought was particularly notable. We've heard from all sorts of people who observed the president's scheme, who were witnesses. Sinners is distinctive because he presents himself as somebody who was actually involved, who was swept up, carried along, part of the insanity, frankly, that was playing out on the part of the president's team. And he also has presented this image of how it got to the point where people working for Trump were essentially just throwing spaghetti noodles against the wall, saying, is this something we could do? Let's do it, without thought as to legality, propriety, or the Constitution. So that, I thought, was a really striking voice to hear on this topic. Of course, there's also Cassidy Hutchinson saying that the White House counsel's office itself said that this scheme was not legally sound, and it wasn't something that the president's team should be doing. You had presidential campaign lawyers distancing from themselves from this scheme, trying to suggest that they basically passed the baton to Rudy and didn't want to be involved. I mean, so many people who saw what was going on and knew it was wrong, and clearly Trump's decision was, rather than listening to people he trusted, people he had relationships with, people he'd known for years, instead he chose to listen to whoever was telling him what he wanted to hear. That's the through line that connects all of this, and it really was crystallized in this hearing in a significant way.
Let me play some more of the testimony. This is number 6. This is the Pennsylvania House Speaker, Brian Cutler, on his calls from Rudy Giuliani.
Another legislator, Pennsylvania House Speaker Brian Cutler, received daily voicemails from Trump's lawyers in the last week of November.
Mr. Speaker, this is Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis. We're calling you together because we'd like to discuss, obviously, the election.
Hello, Mr. Speaker. This is Jenna Ellis, and I'm here with Mayor Giuliani.
Hey, Brian, it's Rudy. I really have something important to call to your attention that I think really changes things.
Cutler felt that the outreach was inappropriate and asked his lawyers to tell Rudy Giuliani to stop calling, but Giuliani continued to reach out.
I understand that you don't want to talk to me now. I just want to bring some facts to your attention and talk to you as a fellow Republican.
So, Miles, what followed this evidence that they entered was Steve Bannon sending protest is a generous word, the mob to his house. I mean, the violence that was incited by Donald Trump was part of a series of violence directed at election officials and local Republican officials who refused to overturn the results of the election. But it commenced well before January 6th.
Yeah, we learned today, Nicole, yet again, that this plot to overturn the election was premeditated, it was multifaceted, and as you noted, it was violent. On the premeditated side, the committee showed very clearly that there was documentation, there was planning, there were legal rationales. This was a well thought through 7-stage process. On the multifaceted piece, we saw that today. We saw that with the discussion of fake electors, Trump's effort to find fake votes to win. And also we've seen that in recent weeks with the conversation about fake authorities for the vice president or these state and local officials to overturn the election. It had many, many prongs. But, importantly, this was also violent. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was very much mafia-like tactics that were used as a last resort to pressure people to undertake the actions that it was clear to the White House, state and local officials, as well as federal officials, up to and including the vice president, were unwilling to undertake. And so they sort of dispensed with the legal rhetoric. They dispensed with the exhortations to duty. They dispensed with conversations like Rudy just left in that voicemail. Hey, maybe you should do this because we're fellow Republicans, and ultimately just resorted to mob-like violent intimidation. And we saw that with election workers. We saw that with members of Congress. We saw that, of course, culminating in a violent insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. This should be especially concerning in addition to all of the other laws that look like they may have been violated as part of this scheme. There needs to be a very specific review of the criminal behavior that was geared towards physical violence and threats towards some of these individuals, which were extensive.
Jason, I want to play Ruby Freeman's testimony because I think the mob comparison is good, but the reality is that what these people experienced was nothing short of being terrorized. Let me play that.
Right.
There is nowhere I feel safe. Nowhere. Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you? The President of the United States is supposed to represent every American, not to target one, but he targeted me, Lady Ruby, a small business owner, a mother, a proud American citizen who stand up to help Fulton County run an election in the middle of the pandemic.
Jason Johnson.
I don't like engaging what I call performative blackness, right? The whole hagiography of what black folk are supposed to do in politics and how we're supposed to pray and sing and dance in order to elicit certain type of sympathy. But the level of rage that I and people that I know had when we saw this testimony is beyond anything I've probably experienced since George Floyd. That's my grandmother. That is literally the kind of work that my grandmother used to do in Newark, New Jersey. Registering people to vote, taking seniors in buses to go here and there, getting young people registered to vote. The level of violence that the Republican organization engages in against black people on a regular basis should make everything that happens in this trial pale in comparison. This is what they do. This is what they do. This is why Randy Bowman and Raffles, this is why I don't care about them getting threatening calls. Because you know what happens to them? They go back to their offices and they get security. You know what happens to people on the Supreme Court when they get threatened? They get security paid for by the Senate, but not regular black people who are just doing their jobs. Not people who have lost their name, the ability to go to the grocery store, the ability to just live their regular lives, for having the audacity to stand against the white nationalist coup that masquerades as the Republican Party. What angers me so much, honestly, Nicole, about that testimony is that I know that those women are going to get additional threats because they were brave enough to get on television and talk about what happened. And I also know that the party that is putting these hearings together is going to do little or nothing to keep those people safe when we face this again this fall. This was the most infuriating part of these hearings that I've ever seen. Every single one of these people should be in jail, and if they're not, it is an absolute abdication of responsibility by this committee, by Merrick Garland, all the way up into the White House.
Jason Johnson, we've had a lot of conversations, but maybe none like this one. I'm going to need you to say more.
The way that Donald Trump has sort of weaponized his own bigotry, right? There was a guy who I talked to in the summer of 2020 named Nathan Calloway. Columbus, Ohio, who was like providing medical aid during a Black Lives Matter protest. And Trump put him in a tweet, and people chased him around. And here we are 2 or 3 years later. How many different people does Donald Trump and his cronies have to attack, have to threaten before we recognize that the man is a terrorist and everybody who works with him is a terrorist and Rudy Giuliani is a terrorist? This is not political activity. This is not passion. And I don't want to hear anything about the braveness of Bowman or Raffensperger or whatever. You know what? Because those guys engage in the very same voter suppression policies that led to people feeling emboldened enough that they could threaten black women like that. Let's look at what Raffensperger has done in Georgia. Let's look at how many times he's worked with the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Look at how many times he's gone after the New Georgia Project. This is what they do. So I don't care about them standing in front and saying, oh my gosh, for the first time in my life, I am the subject of the same kind of violence that I've been using the state apparatus to put against black people for the last 35 years. And this will be the norm, Nicole. This will be the norm for every other election, as long as we actually have them going forward, if this committee and the Justice Department doesn't get serious about this. Do you think, see, we watch this stuff and we're disgusted right now. And I'm angry, and I'm getting text messages from people. We're angry and disgusted. You know, right now, people in Georgia are emboldened by this. They see these black women crying, and they love it. They love that kind of pain. They love that kind of oppression. What do you think these people have been doing it for? Because they want to move us back to the America where you could treat black people like this all the time. And every single time you have a hearing like this and nobody goes to jail and nobody gets perp walk and nobody's in an orange jumpsuit, they think we can do this again. And next time there won't be any guardrails. We have to do something about this. Yeah, and simply complaining about it is not enough.
I mean, so Jason, I played this yesterday. Congressman Clyburn elevated a question I've been asking all the time. We only analyze Merrick Garland. What if he does or doesn't indict Donald Trump? What's the precedent of investigating, your current boss's predecessor who's in the other party? It seems to me that the whole calculation has shifted with all of this evidence of criminality and not just crimes of passion, but crimes of months-long conspiracy. I mean, the committee is presenting evidence of a months-long conspiracy directed by Donald Trump, quarterbacked by John Eastman, implemented by Rudy Giuliani, with his campaign apparatus kind of jumping on and off the bus like one of those, open-top tour buses to participate in various aspects of it, that went on for many, many months. And I wonder your thoughts on Congressman Clyburn's analysis that what he's hearing on the ground from constituents all across the country is anger that it appears that Donald Trump is above the law.
Not only that Donald Trump is above the law. Look, this conspiracy is huge now, right? We've got more. More member of this conspiracy than Herschel Walker's got kids, right? Like every single week, we're finding out somebody else was involved in this process, and nobody seems to be getting in trouble. And what you have happening with a lot of voters, and not just African American voters, but I'm saying Nicole voters in general, is when you see lawlessness and you see people not being held accountable, it makes you frustrated with the process. It makes you think, well, why should I bother to do with anything? You know, from January 6th to this, you see these people engaging in this behavior and like, well, if they're not going to be held accountable, why do I believe this government will protect me? If they're not going to be held accountable, why do I want to wait in line 6.5 hours for this to be done? I understand what the congressman is saying, because he is not just speaking about his constituents. This is what I hear, Nicole, from my students, from my parents, from my friends, from everybody who doesn't do this every day for a living. They look at this and they say, if I engage in a conspiracy like this to steal money from the local PTA, I'd be in jail. So how the hell can people trying to steal the whole government not be facing any consequences except for a tough hearing, half of which they decide they don't even want to show up?
Yeah, I mean, Miles, I want to come to you both on these questions of violence. I mean, this is normalized isn't strong enough. This is being operationalized on the right, this tactic of mob protests. And I wanted to clip that Bannon soundbite about how horrific it is, because it's horrific to do it to anybody. But as Jason said, the winners and losers are chosen in terms of who we protect. We should protect everybody. And frankly, if we healed the sickness of our politics, there wouldn't be incitements to violence. But Donald Trump's incitements to violence are ongoing. The Thursday of the first public hearing, he described the insurrection as the greatest moment in the MAGA movement. Not only has he not condemned any of the acts of his supporters, he continues to be enthusiastic about them.
Yeah, what did he say the day of, Nicole? You know, we love you and remember this day forever, something along those lines. You know, those messages aren't lost on the millions of people that are following Donald Trump. And you just mentioned Bannon. I don't know if I should admit this, but occasionally I listen to Bannon's podcast, The War Room, to understand what he is saying to these audiences. He calls the younger generation of people that follow him his assassins. Right. He doesn't call them his acolytes or his lieutenants or the digital guy. He calls them his assassins. They are thinking about politics as violence. That has become institutionalized in the Republican Party now. And, you know, I was just talking the other day to a Republican congressman that quit the party and left during Donald Trump's rise. And just the other week, he was given a speech in the Midwest to a couple hundred people, largely Republican audience. And he went in worried that, you know, maybe a fourth of the audience would say that the election was stolen. But he wanted to get a sense. And he asked the question to the crowd, how many of you think the election was stolen from Donald Trump? And he said almost 100% of the audience raised their hands. He asked a second question, how many of you think that the January 6th insurrection was a peaceful protest? Again, almost 100% raised their hands. We are not talking about rare instances of criminality. We are talking about the masses being brainwashed around this rhetoric that's being used for violence. What Jason just mentioned about the election worker, I agree, was an extremely powerful scene, and it's just the tiniest tip of an iceberg. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of unreported stories across this country of political intimidation that is exploding in our civic lives at the moment.
Everyone is sticking around. We have much more to come here. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.